Good morning, afternoon, or evening, folks, and welcome to Cast of All Trades. I'm your host, Orion Siebert, and in this episode, I talk about learning styles, what they are, why they don't actually exist, why people still believe in them, what you should care about instead, and more. First, learning styles. What are they? There are many different models for learning styles, but the most popular is considered the VARK model: visual, auditory, reading/writing, and kinesthetic. The idea of learning styles is that people will learn things better if you teach them according to their learning style, or it's supposedly the way that they learn best. People pitch the idea such as teachers have teaching styles, therefore learners should also have learning styles, or students should have learning styles. And when you poll people to see how many of them believe in learning styles, over 90% of students and teachers believe in learning styles. So to quickly touch on each of them, visual learning is considered learning through pictures and demonstrations. Auditory learning is learning through stories and sound. Reading and writing is learning through words and text. And kinesthetic learning is learning by doing things. But in reality, there is no such thing as learning styles. It's a myth that we've been told for years now. Instead, what I believe is really happening here is that people are conflating learning preferences and learning styles. Just because you have a preference for something doesn't mean you'll perform any better by learning through that preference. And there are a couple examples I'll go through in a second. But first of all, people often mistake learning preferences for learning styles, and I can understand why, because these two ideas are easily conflated. For example, I like listening to audiobooks much more than I like reading. I much prefer sitting in a class listening to a lecture of a teacher going on about whatever topic this class is about than sitting down and reading through a textbook. Therefore, for a long time, I thought I am an auditory learner, not a reading or written learner. But when I consider it more fully, I figure out, oh, I just prefer listening. That doesn't mean that I'm any better at. That doesn't mean that I learn better through listening compared to through reading and writing, or through looking at demonstrations, or through doing things physically. So, why are learning styles BS? When we look at learning styles research, which is something that's been going on for at least half a century now from what I've seen, we see a common trend, that being no trend. A good example of some of the studies that we've seen across the learning styles research, it goes as follows. Say we have 200 students, 100 claim to be visual learners and 100 claim to be auditory learners. We split these groups up, so we have two lessons going on. In lesson 1, we have 50 visual learners and 50 auditory learners, and the lesson is almost entirely visual. In the second lesson, we have 50 visual learners and 50 auditory learners, and have an almost entirely auditory lesson. Then, when we give these two groups the same exact test, who do you think performs best on that test? Most people who believe in learning styles would think that, okay, we're going to have 100 people who do well on that test. We're going to have the 50 visual learners who were in the visual learning supporting class, or the visual learning supporting lesson, who will do well, and we'll have the 50 auditory learners who are in the auditory class who will do well, when in reality there was absolutely no correlation between the learning styles that were presented in each class and the learners in said class. Everyone performed about the same. And we see this across domains and across nearly every single study of learning styles done. And this is done over 50 years of research in learning styles. There is little to no correlation between stated learning styles and test results. When we want to learn something, we are storing information in terms of meaning, and it's not actually tied to any one particular sense. This may sound a bit convoluted at first, but hear me out. When we're learning math, we're not remembering. It's a little hard to explain, but when we're learning math, we're not actually trying to remember the sensory information of the math class. We're not visually remembering the formulas. We're not visually remembering the I guess formulas is probably the best way to put it. We're not visually remembering each and every single rule. What we're doing is we're using our senses to essentially take in meaning, and then it's that ultimately it's that meaning that we want to get from whatever class that we're taking, whatever skill we're trying to learn. And we see this across all domains, from math to dance to whatever you want to say. So I know it might seem a little nuanced or a little bit too, like, it might seem like I'm saying the same thing, that meaning and sensory, many people might believe that meaning and sensory information are considered the same thing, but this isn't the case, and we actually have a good example of how we know this. So, an example of this would be when we look at chess players. There was a study done where we looked at chess players who were asked to quickly memorize boards. When we looked at novices trying to memorize boards, that they were shown for so these chess players were shown boards for about 5 seconds, and they were asked to quickly memorize the boards and then place the chess pieces on a similar chessboard to see how many they could match up. Novices and intermediate players didn't do so hot. They were able to memorize a couple pieces, usually 4 to 5 to 6 at most. However, when we had experts memorize boards, they could come up with 20 plus pieces on the board pretty quickly, pretty easily. Now, what's interesting about this is that these boards that they were showing were boards that would regularly come up in play. So these are boards that experts had there was meaning to these boards for experts. These are boards that they would come up with time and time again. They've seen them a number of times. They have an idea of, if I'm in this board state, this is what I'm going to do next. There is meaning behind having that board state there. However, when we change from meaningful board states to either random, seemingly impossible, or totally useless junk boards, as I'm going to call them, the experts had little to no ability to memorize the boards. They were the exact same as the novices and the intermediate players. So what can we take away from that? We can take away that people who might originally say, oh, chess players are visual learners or they're kinesthetic learners because they're seeing the boards, they're actively playing the game, that's how they are learning. They should be able to see and know these chessboards off the top of their head. While that is correct in some way, what's happening is that these experts are collecting information. They're getting sensory information from playing the game that they couldn't otherwise get. They're taking the meaning and they're applying it. It doesn't matter how they collect the information. The sensory bit doesn't matter. What matters is that they get the meaning and there's a purpose for that meaning. That's also a reason why most experts, when they're talking about how to properly study for an exam, why rereading or rewriting notes typically doesn't help you learn or retain any information. Instead, if you want to retain or learn information, it needs to be organized in some manner that is meaningful and applicable. Sure, some people might say, okay, you might have a point there of perhaps we are just looking for meaning in what we're trying to learn and what we're trying to do. But certainly I'm different. Certainly I have an advantage in one thing or another. For example, people with perfect pitch, they are auditory learners because they're going to do well in music. Well, sure, some people are going to have some advantages in some areas over other people. For example, that perfect pitch person is likely going to do better in music class or in situations that heavily rely on auditory situations. However, that isn't going to go across, that isn't going to cross boundaries usually. It doesn't translate over to geography or skateboarding or blacksmithing. I don't care about your perfect pitch. That's not going to help you learn geography if you're just sitting there listening to someone read off a bunch of countries. You're not going to be able to go from, yes, China is next to Mongolia, which is next to Russia, which is next to yada, 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 yada. You're not going to be able to learn geography from just listening to things. Sure, some people will have advantages in certain areas with information processing, but often this sensory boost that we might have in certain areas helps us notice maybe a few more details. But rarely is this information that we're processing actually useful or meaningful in some way. Typically, the extra information that we're getting is involved with, I guess, if we're going with the auditory example and the perfect pitch example, the details aren't that useful, such as remembering the pitch or the tone of the voice that's reading the science test review. That's not going to helpful. That's not going to be helpful to you. That's not going to be extra meaningful to you. Ultimately, what it comes down to is how well can you translate sensory information into meaning? And from what we've seen across 50 years of studies and research, is that there is no one, people may have preferences for how they receive information, but their preferences do not necessarily align with what is going to work best for them. So, moving on to, why does this idea of learning styles even still exist? And it's a good question, and it's one that involves us thinking about, why do a lot of wrong ideas still exist nowadays? It's that ideas take a long time to die off. It's a popular idea that people believed in for a while, and it's hard to kill off ideas that sound nice. For example, it took decades for people to accept that the world is round and not flat, even after many astronomers and mathematicians were using round Earth-based equations because they were easier than flat Earth-based equations. These same astronomers and mathematicians took a long time to finally acknowledge, okay, maybe the Earth is round. And for a long time, people considered it heresy to claim that the Earth is round. Today, we look back on that and we think, that seems quite foolish. Like, you have this information in front of you that says, oh, the Earth is clearly round. How could you not believe that? But this happens a lot of the time. In fact, many of us likely have fallen victim to similar thinking today. Just because a lot of people believe in something doesn't make it right. And people don't like to be proven wrong. People ignore information that doesn't support their worldview, either consciously or unconsciously. It's, what's it called? It's some sort of bias, and I'm forgetting what it's called currently. But we do this in our daily lives all the time. Perhaps some of us know people who do it consciously, where you start talking about something and they'll put their hands over their ears and start screaming, la, 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 la. Your information does not pertain to me. I don't care. I'm going to ignore it. I'm going to live my truth. And that is total BS. At the same time, many of us will also do this unconsciously, whether that be in our Google searches or in our just day-to-day actions. A good example of this is when you're looking for information about an idea that you support, oftentimes the searches that you put in are going to be biased towards, give me more information that supports my beliefs or my standing on XYZ thing. A good example of this is one that I've seen in religion a lot of the time. I know I use a lot of religious examples. It's just what I'm familiar with. A lot of people will essentially set up the equation to say, I believe this religion is true. Therefore, my search queries are going to say, I want this information that supports my standing on this religion being true or on this fact being true, even though that fact might not be true. So they're actively seeking biased information that supports their beliefs over actively seeking truth. So that's just one example. And continuing to dive into this, why do people still believe in learning styles? Well, it's really well marketed. Oftentimes, it doesn't matter how bad the idea is. If you can put it and wrap it up into a pretty bow, if you want an idea to stick, it has to sound good. People have to feel drawn to it, and people like to feel special. Learning styles is a great way to make someone feel special. They can say, "Ah, yes, I'm a visual learner. I feel special because of that. I have this identity because of it." If you can give someone an identity that they can associate with for whatever reason, they're going to happily associate with that, even if that identity has no merit, no backing, no anything else behind it, aside from this sounds good and this sounds right. There's a reason why we perform research on things that to a lot of people might seem self-evident, and then when we get results that support those self-evident beliefs, we're like, okay, did you really have to spend like hundreds of thousands of dollars perhaps trying to confirm that yes, this thing is bad for you? We've known this for a long time. But at the same time, when we do perform research on things that might be considered self-evident, that when we get that research back says, actually, no, we were wrong about this thing, then there's a good reason that we did that research. We learned from it. We learned that, hey, we were wrong. So there's a reason why we do spend money on research. At the same time, people don't like being wrong. So even if we do research and get information that says we've been wrong about this thing for a very long time. For example, smoking. A lot of people know today that smoking is wrong, smoking is bad. But for a long time, people said, yes, if you want to help clear your lungs, a good smoke will help you do that. Where today we think that's preposterous. Why would we do that? And yet today we still have people who smoke. There are still some people who are willfully ignorant to say, yes, smoking is a good thing. It helps me clear my lungs. It helps me do whatever, because it was an idea that was marketed well for a long time. So, moving on from that, if learning styles don't matter, what should we be focusing on instead? And it's important that we do focus on something else instead, because if we do continue to focus on the idea of learning styles, then one, it's a waste of time, and two, we could be spending our time, money, whatever else on something better that's actually going to work. In most schools today, we still have teachers and students that focus on this idea of learning styles of, the teacher needs to know the exact learning styles of each of their students so that they can create content or create teaching material that's best suited to help their students' learning styles supposedly learn better. When if we can stop that, say, actually no, it doesn't matter how... Correction, it still does matter how the teacher does teach things, but they shouldn't have to care about a student's learning style to create good content or good teaching material. It saves teachers time, effort, stress, and there's so many more. There are other levers that you could pull that have much greater leverage than a false idea of learning styles. Luckily, we do also have a lot of research about how we can learn more effectively. And probably the best way to learn something is to learn it in context, or as close to in context as possible. There are a couple examples of this that I want to go over. So I already touched on this a bit earlier, but learning geography. You're not going to learn much geography if you never see a map. You want to learn skills that are going to be used in context. So if the goal of learning geography is to be able to point out where every country is on the map, or to point out where a city is on the map, you should probably do traditionally visual focused learning, where you have a map in front of you and you are going through and finding each city, each state, each country, each nation, each continent, whatever it is you're doing, and put that into practice. Perhaps the best thing you could do right away is to have a blank map in front of you a list of countries and say, okay, you might not know anything. Well, you might think you don't know anything. So go through and start filling this out with your best guesses. Then, once you do that, we can go refer to an actual map, compare your answers, then try again and keep going and do that again and again and again. And before long, you're going to know where every country is on the map. Congratulations, you learned geography. I don't care if you're an auditory learner. I don't care if you're a olfactory learner who has to learn by smelling things. You're not going to learn geography by sniffing a map or by hearing people talk about geography all the time. You're going to learn it by looking at it and by doing it. Similarly, you're not going to learn public speaking. You're not going to make much progress as a public speaker if all you ever do is read books about public speaking. And on top of that, even if you are out speaking in public, what's the exact context that you want to learn the skill in? For example, do you just want to be better at talking over the dinner table with your parents? Okay, then why don't you have dinner with your family more often? Why don't you start off each meal by trying to ask about each other's day? By talking in context, by applying context to the skill, to the thing you're trying to learn, you're going to improve on it much faster and much better, because you don't have to focus on absolutely everything that you need for a thing. If you're learning something in context, then one, by practicing in context, you're going to be getting better at doing the exact thing you want to do. And two, by practicing in context, you can skip over all the extra fluff that you might not care about. Are you going to be speaking in front of 50,000 people regularly? If not, then is that something that you should go pursue as a public speaker? I mean, it could be helpful for down the line if you want to do that. But if all you care about is being able to give a good presentation to a boardroom of like 5 executives, then congratulations. You have a practice setting that you can set up. You might not have access to 5 executives all the time that you can practice your public speaking skills with. Instead, you could go grab like 5 people you really respect, or people you know have experience, or people that you know could guide you in some way, to say, I'm going to give you a presentation. Here's the context I'm giving it in. Help me out with this. Essentially, the closer you can either simulate the context you're working in or actually be in that context, the better. That might require you to listen to things, such as with music. You're not going to make it far if you don't listen to the music, if you don't practice playing, if you don't see the music in front of you, or if you don't see or do the things that it takes to do it. I'm trying to practice to get better at being a podcast presenter. And how am I doing that? By recording more podcasts, by doing it time and time again, by strategizing, by researching and figuring out what are some things that other people recommend, and taking that and applying it. Say, what is the closest I can get to being in context as possible? For me, that means sitting down with my podcast notes, with my microphone, with my software open, to sit down and actually record, to speak, and to try to keep doing this over and over again. And over time, as I record more podcasts, as I listen back to them, as I point out flaws to say, I could do better here, I could do better here, I could do better here. Here's my new plan to keep going. Great. I have learned. Finally, the last bit I want to touch on for this learning in context thing is my experience in a dance class. So before this, I had little to no dance experience. I had been to 2 swing dancing classes years ago. Each of those 2 classes were years apart. And I had learned a little bit of hip hop from a friend, and I learned a little bit of tap dancing from a friend. And that was it. I had learned absolutely no ballroom dancing, which is the class I was about to take. So what was the goal of the class? My personal goal was I wanted to become the best dancer in that class. And to me, that meant I had to get the highest score on the exam at the end of the semester. Okay, I had my goal, I had my context, I knew exactly what that exam was going to look like, I was aware of what dances I had to do for it, and I had a plan, I had time. So to do that, there were a couple things I had to do. First, because I didn't know anything about ballroom dancing, I had to watch my teacher. I had to watch her, I had to follow her steps. I could not learn to dance through listening alone, even though my general preference, as I stated before, for learning is through audio and storytelling. I had to watch my professor, then I had to follow her steps, I had to do what she did, then I had to take the next step. Okay? So, first step in context is me learning the basic steps. Next step, approaching that in context learning, is me practicing with a partner. The next step above that is going to the competitions throughout the semester and practicing for those. One step above that is preparing for the exams. And one step above that is preparing and doing the actual exam. Each step along the way, I am getting closer and closer and closer to actually being in context for this thing, for this goal that I want to do, for developing this skill. That often meant that I was practicing in situations that were not identical to the end context. For example, if I wanted to practice in my apartment, I don't exactly have a ballroom here I can practice in. So I would dance up and down the hallway as I brushed my teeth each night. It sounds kind of ridiculous, but it worked. By the end of the semester, I want to say it was 2 points. I had the highest score on the final medal exam for our ballroom dance class, and it was great. I loved it. I enjoyed ballroom dance the entire time. And it was by working through this, by working in context of the skill that I'm developing. Instead of taking a learner-first approach, it's better to take a skills-first approach. Look at what's the end goal, what are you trying to do with this, what is required to get to this thing. You need to align your learning with the skill you're actually trying to do. So ultimately, what this leads up to is one of the best strategies for learning anything, aside from learning in context. This is something that we already do for the most part, and I'm calling it learning stacking, but really it's called multimodal learning, where it's learning using multiple strategies, hence why videos are so good. Videos take advantage of our visual learning cortex, our audio learning, and sometimes even more, such as writing if you're writing notes along with it, or kinesthetic if you're following along with the video. And the reason that this works so well is because it's activating multiple areas of your brain. You're creating more memory pathways. You're taking the information, the sensory information, turning it into meaning that is making connections across many different areas of your brain. So ultimately, you're not going to do as good learning something if you're just watching it, or if you're just writing about it, if you're just reading about it, if you're just listening about it, or if you're just doing it. If you're able to tap into many sensory options and put them together, you're going to have a much easier time learning because you're connecting more areas of your brain together as you're learning. You're taking in more information, you're processing it, you're turning that information into meaningful, useful data that your brain can turn to when you want to go back to that skill. So, in summary, learning skills are BS. No one is a visual learner, an auditory learner, a kinesthetic learner. We are all multimodal learners. We learn best by learning in context of things. We've studied this for over half a century at least, and yet this myth of learning styles still persists. Sure, we may have preferences for how we want to learn things, but that doesn't necessarily mean we are actually going to learn better by following our preferences. Instead, focus on the skill you want to learn. Focus on the context of it. What is it going to require for you to go from A to B? What is it going to actually take for you to go from someone with absolutely no skills in public speaking to a master public speaker in the exact context you want to be in? And ultimately, just because an idea sounds good does not mean it's right. When you're looking at the next skill that you're working on, forget about your learning style. Forget about all of that. Instead, just remember this. Align your learning with the skill you're actually trying to learn. Align it towards the context you want to learn it in. Don't worry about learning styles. You'll be just fine. If you enjoyed this episode of Cast of All Trades, I have 3 super easy things I'd like you to do that would mean the world to me. First, subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss out on our next episode. Second, while you're in your podcast app of choice, give the show a 5-star review. It helps us reach more people and in turn help us change lives through generalism. Third, share this episode with a friend or two, someone you think will gain a lot from the show. Word of mouth is the best way to help a podcast grow. And if your friend likes the show, they'll thank you for introducing them to it. It's a win-win. With all that said, best of luck, tradesmen, and I'll talk to y'all later. Ciao.